Annalee Newitz, who's a writer for IO9 and is quite prolific. As Ramesh suggested, she's been very prolific about writing about technology. So we're very privileged to have her here today. And I think Annalee's talking about writing or knowing your audience and how to communicate with the audiences who you're intending to address. So in the interest of time, I'd like to invite Annalee to the stage. Thanks very much, Annalee.
So I've done a lot of writing about the future, which is somewhat factual writing. I've also done a little science fiction writing, and I've also done strict science journalism for places like Wired and Popular Science and stuff like that. So I kind of, in terms of my writing experiences, I kind of straddle three worlds where some of my writing has to be absolutely factual, can't be speculative, and if it is, it's not good science journalism. And then some of my writing has to be completely speculative or it's not good futuristic writing. So what I wanted to do today was really just talk specifically about the kinds of writing that we do as people who want to talk about the future, whether we're trying to do factual writing about things that might really happen, whether we want to write allegorically in the context of science fiction, or whether we want to do stuff that's pretty realistic and set in the present, sort of about scientific trends, some of which Ramez was just talking about. So first what I want to say is, and I think probably all of you already know this, but futurism is not about predicting the future. Absolutely not. Anyone who tells you or tries to do otherwise is probably doing futurism wrong. So what I would suggest is that futurism, and here I'm talking strictly about stuff that's not fictional. We're just talking about things like people who are writing about, you know, speculations about what could come tomorrow. I would class it kind of with advocacy journalism. And advocacy journalism is different from, say, what you read in the New York Times. It's writing which is factual, it's based on reporting, but it's also about advancing a particular point of view or agenda. So sometimes advocacy journalism is political in nature, like you might see on Huffington Post or on Fox News. That's advocacy journalism. Those are people who are reporting facts, but they're doing it with a particular political agenda in mind. They're advocating a position. Other kinds of advocacy journalism may be more like what we're familiar with from futurism, which is advocating a particular idea of where we might go in the future, but not just where we might go, but what it might mean to us as a civilization. So how it might change us, what the scenario is. And it's generally doing this with a goal of advocating that we work hard to get there. And that's the advocacy part. A vision of the future, but also, gee, like, let's hurry up and make that happen, or not. And so, in the interest of talking about how this kind of advocacy writing works, and really I'm kind of addressing you guys both as readers of futurism, but also potential writers, or current writers. The question is, what kind of futurism do you want to do? What do you want to advocate? Instead of focusing on, like I said, trying to predict some future that you can't possibly predict because you never know what's going to happen for sure, you really need to be thinking about how your argument is advocating for something in particular. So to that end, I want to talk about three different kinds of futurist writing. The first one is dystopian writing. And actually, Mez was doing a great job talking about that a little bit with bringing up 1984 as a perfect example of dystopian futurism. There's also a very famous essay by Bill Joy that came out in Wired magazine, The Future Doesn't Need Us, which was really the first popularization of the idea that nanotechnology and super intelligent computers might lead to a gray goo scenario where we all are absorbed into nanotech. And Greg Bear wrote a great novel about this called Blood Music, where all humans are like evaporated and turned into like giant blankets that cover cities. And anyway, the idea is we're all going to be broken down. We're going to turn into, we're just going to be the raw materials for the nanites. And then more recently, we've had books like One that haunts me a lot, even though I disagreed vehemently with almost everything in it, was Margaret Atwood's book Oryx and Crake, which is a very anti-GMO book, radically misunderstands how people use the internet, and yet at the same time it's a very powerful, powerful dystopian vision of what would happen if a couple of trends today with the manufacture of genetically engineered animals and the propagation of child porn online and a lot of other sort of dark aspects of our high-tech culture, kind of what the world would be like that would come out of that. And of course it's a world where we completely fuck ourselves, right? We basically breed a generation of humans who hate all of us and want to kill us, and they do. And they kill us with a disease, and they actually, should I give you guys spoilers? I probably shouldn't. Anyway, they kill all of us with a disease, and then something happens. You should read it. At any rate, I think we're all familiar with what the function is of dystopian writing, whether it's in the realist vein or semi-realist vein of Bill Joy or Margaret Atwood's fictional ideas. It's intended as a warning. It's a way of saying to people, here are trends happening right now, whether those are social trends or technological trends or some combination of the two, and here's how those will destroy us in the end. And so they are advocating for a different future, right? So by showing a dark and negative future, the advocacy is to say, hey, for example, with Oryx and Crake, let's stop genetically engineering animals. Or in the case of 1984, hey, maybe totalitarianism wasn't that great of a thing in the end. It started out as a cool idea, and then it like led to people not having sex, and it was terrible. And other things. I'm making light of it, but that's the goal. It's very simple. So then the second kind of futurism that I want to talk about is what I'm calling aspirational futurism. And I very carefully don't want to use the term utopian futurism because I think there's two things. I mean, utopianism is its own genre. It's often about creating a kind of allegorical parallel world that can't really ever exist. It may tell a story kind of like a fairy tale does, it may have a moral, but it's not an effort to actually, not always an effort to actually extrapolate from real trends in our world today. It's also used a lot as a kind of a smear for anyone who's doing futurist work where they're, for example, like Mez was just doing, where he's saying, look, everything's gonna be like super awesome, we're gonna have implants, and we're gonna have big muscles, and we're gonna be like those mice and stuff, and people will just say, oh, well, that's just utopian. And I think that, so it's important to say that this kind of futurism is aspirational, meaning it's futurism like what Ray Kurzweil does, for example, or like what you see in Star Trek, where it's advocating for a particular future based on trends that we see around us now. And it actually is true that based on the science that we see around us, based on the aspirations of many people in this room and throughout the world, we could really have a more peaceful culture in the future where we, look for strange new worlds with peace in our heart, and whenever anything goes wrong, we have Whoopi Goldberg to steer us right. That's a Star Trek The Next Generation reference. Sorry. But the idea is that, again, like dystopian visions, these aspirational visions are intended to really provide impetus for people to change the way they're acting now to make that future happen. So you're encouraging people to, for example, on a really basic level, have hope that humans are going to be here in 1,000 years or 500 years, which is the Star Trek timescale. That's actually really fucking profound. The idea that we're actually going to still be here as a species in 1,000 years or 5,000 years, right now, given how incredibly dystopian so much of our fiction and writing is, that alone is a kind of aspiration. And in fact, William Gibson told me that he thinks of his books as being kind of, not utopian, but not dystopian, because he's like, look, everybody survived. I mean, we're still around in the future. And he actually is working on a future science fiction novel again. So he's going back to the future. And the other thing about aspirational futurism is it provides us with, like I said, with hope, that we might actually, by changing what we're doing, make it through. And also, a lot of times, aspirational futurism is used to raise money for science projects and science experiments, endeavors like having a space program, which again sounds really aspirational at this point. Like, wouldn't it be awesome if we had a space program where, that was actually really well funded? And so a lot of times you'll see aspirational futurism being used in the service of raising funds for science, raising funds for weird alternative cultural experiments, raising funds for all kinds of stuff that might make the world a better place. And the third kind of futurism that I want to talk about, I kind of lied. I said at the beginning, futurism is not about predicting the future. It's about advocating for a certain vision of what we might become. There actually is one kind of futurism, which I would call realistic or pragmatic futurism, that not only is about predicting the future, but actually does predict the future. It actually works. And what I'm talking about is stuff like predicting weather patterns. For example, when we just had the storm which hit the East Coast, which I'm still calling Frankenstorm because I thought that was a cool name, but everybody kept saying Sandy. But anyway, so Frankenstorm hits the East Coast, and if you were like me, you were watching the real-time maps that were available from Google, they were available from NOAA, where you could see the path, the projected path of the storm. And certainly no good scientist would have ever said, this is absolutely where the storm is going to go. Everyone who was doing these predictions using weather modeling software was saying, okay, there's a couple different possibilities depending on how the storm goes, but they were able to accurately predict the path of that storm. So one of those possibilities actually came true. And there's also a lot of other kinds of modeling software that are used for everything from predicting traffic patterns, which we can absolutely do, predicting how a mudslide will come down a mountain. There's actually scientists who have software that can look and say, all right, if a mudslide is going to come down this mountain, we know exactly the path it's going to take, we know exactly how people should be evacuated. It actually works. We can actually predict the future with these kinds of models. Google Flu Trends is another fantastic example of predicting the future. Google Flu Trends is just a little thing that somebody at Google set up which analyzes when and where people are searching on terms related to the flu. So like sniffles, aspirin, fever, like anytime people start searching on that stuff, there's a spike that they see in this, like in a particular area, people searching on those terms, and 3 days later, the data that they're getting from the government about infectious disease will follow and say, actually, we just saw a spike in influenza-like symptoms in this area. So it's actually able to predict several days in advance where an influenza-like disease is breaking out. So this is actual futurism that's happening. It's near term. It's days, we know days in advance when a hurricane might hit or where it might hit. We know days in advance where the mudslide is going to go. But it actually is real futurism. And so people who are doing that kind of work, who tend to be people working in policy, people working in government, people designing this kind of modeling software, they actually are engaging in prediction. And people who write futurism based on that stuff, and again, these are people who are often advocating policies, like, for example, advocating, please don't build there because we actually have software that shows us that if you build there, your house will slide down the hill within the next 10 years. This is a huge, huge problem, actually, especially here on the West Coast, where the actual geologists know that houses are being built in areas that are going to be flooded, but there's nothing they can do. There's no law that says you can't build in a floodplain, so people do it. And so there are these kinds of writing, this realistic futurism that is going on, that is an effort to make our lives better, if we're able to listen in time. And I think that you see this kind of realistic futurism happening to a certain extent in organizations like Institute for the Future, or when futurists, for example, are paid by corporations to come in and say, okay, looking at your technology, understanding the life cycle of gadgets, whatever gadget it is, I can predict that yeah, in 2 years you're going to have a market for foo or bar. And so again, it's very near term, but it is a prediction, and oftentimes it's for money. So, given those three things, we have dystopian futurism, aspirational futurism, and realistic futurism, my favorite. The question is, what do you want to do as a futurist? How do you want to change the world? Do you want to protect people who live in an area where they might have a mudslide? Do you want to advocate for a world where we're all polyamorous and get to live with no sexual inhibitions in the far future? Do you want to tell a story where you say, if everyone becomes polyamorous, we are all going to kill each other? That's your dystopian version. There's actually a lot of those, because apparently we kill each other when we have too much sex. So, or too much fun or whatever. So the question is, as a writer, what are you trying to do? And that's the thing, is you have to first know, what is the future that you want us to get to? You can't just say, okay, I'm gonna look at all the stuff that's happening and this is what's likely to come out. It's fine, you can do that if you want to do realistic futurism, and your horizon is gonna be short. You're gonna be able to predict things in the near future, and you will help a lot of people, but you're not going to be able to actually look at trends in the present and say, well, based on this, actually realistically, I can predict in 100 years, we will have turned into squid creatures whose brains are hooked up to super intelligent computers that help us live forever. Okay, you're not going to be able to predict that. So the question is, if you want that to happen, how are you going to tell that story? Are you going to give us hope? Are you going to tell us an aspirational story and show us how great it's going to be when we're all squid who are hooked up to super intelligent computers? Or are you going to tell a dark story about a trend that you see in the present that could prevent that future from happening? And so that's really the goal, I think, of futurist writing, is to keep in mind what you're advocating for. And then, once you know what you want to advocate for, then you have to pick your audience. And again, your audience might be policymakers who are figuring out where people should build houses, or figuring out how to build cities that are robust against disaster. Your audience might be scientists. You might say, all right, I really, really want a human brain-computer interface. I mean, we all do, right? We all want to have a computer in our heads making us smarter. So maybe you want to write to scientists. Maybe you want to influence neuroscience. Maybe you want to write stuff that will appeal to neuroscientists by being very logical and not making grandiose claims and making kind of incremental claims based on evidence. Or maybe you want to speak to the general public. Maybe you want to tell people, you know what? If things keep going the way they are with biotechnology, zombies will kill you. And that's your dark future, is a disease-ridden zombie future. And the reason you're telling that story, perhaps, is to convince the public that actually there are different kinds of medical technologies or different political groups that are pushing us toward this incredibly dark vision. And I'm not saying that dystopian fiction or dystopian writing is the only thing that works for a general public. Obviously, things like Star Trek prove that wrong. I think Star Trek is going to be popular for way longer than Walking Dead, although maybe it's not as popular right now. But I think those are the things to keep in mind. Like, what are you advocating for? Who do you want to talk to? And just always remember, you're not predicting, you're just advocating. And advocating is really, really powerful. Advocating is what changes the future. And so that's what we should keep our eyes on. Great, thanks.
So we do have some time for some questions. I think we got plenty of time for questions. So who would like to ask the first question? Looks as though Randall's the only person with his hand up, so go for it, Randall.
I was just wondering about the very near-term predictive futurism that you talked about. Is there an essential difference between doing that and just doing science, given that science is basically about learning to observe things so that you come up with rules that can help you predict what's going to happen the next time the same thing happens, like, apple falls or whatever?
The question is, how much is this kind of near-term, predictive, realistic futurism just science? I think that that it goes hand in hand with science. I think a lot of the best realistic futurism comes from scientists, but not all science is about prediction. I mean, some of it is. I mean, obviously stuff around epidemics is, stuff where if you're trying to predict perhaps geophysical behaviors or something like that. But some science is more observational in nature. It has to do with creating therapies, which are not always about predicting. Sometimes it is about predicting how are your genes going to respond to a particular thing. So I guess what I would say in answer to that question is yes and no. I think it has to go hand in hand with science. But one of the things about scientists that you may have noticed is that they're kind of busy doing science. They're kind of busy building these models, doing the observations to create these models. And so it often takes an outside advocate to take that science and turn it into a message that can be received by anyone from a city council to a government agency that might be responsible for like flu predictions. So there has to be someone else doing that, because we can't ask scientists to be their own advocates all the time because we want them doing fucking science. Sorry, but so I think it's both.
Okay, anybody else? I might ask a question, and that is, I really liked your point that we should be advocates for the science or the future that we want to see. However, when we build narratives, often we need to capture the audience's attention, and maintaining that attention or getting enough sales for your book may be the primary motive for doing this. I think we need to get better at developing narratives that incorporate these aspirations and that maintain people's attention spans throughout a nice long book. How would you go about encouraging people to do this?
So it really depends, again, on who your audience is for your book. So I think you're assuming if you...
A science fiction, for instance.
A science fiction book, like something that you want to become a bestseller. If your main goal is just to sell books, then that's obviously going to dilute your ability to advocate for this future that you're looking for, because you then do have to, of course, provide a narrative, which, as Mez was saying, you also have to have dramatic tension in that. So I think what you have to do is, again, keep in mind what is the future that you're trying to advocate for, and how can you tell a story that's engaging, that questions that future, that twists that future. The thing about novel writing that's fantastic is you can have multiple characters who represent different points of view. And it's very helpful for people, I think, especially when they're being exposed to a new idea about a future. Like, say, the future that you're advocating for is one where all of our minds are linked and we have direct democracy because it's coming right from our cerebral cortex. For a lot of people, the idea of having your brain hooked up to a computer is creepy, don't want to do it. So how do you dramatize that? That's what fiction is great for, is you have a character who says, absolutely, I don't want to do that. And you have maybe someone's, arc, like their plot arc, demonstrating the dark side of doing something like that. And then you have another arc demonstrating the more aspirational side of doing that. And I think that's one of the things about fiction, is that when you're writing fiction, if you want it to be good, it can't just be allegorical. It has to be ambivalent. It has to be ambiguous. You can't ever have, sure, you can write a piece of fiction where you're like, this is us building a space elevator. Kind of what Neil Stephenson wants us to do now is like, let's have a cheerful book about how we all get together and build a thing. And I think that's great. I'm like pro having optimistic science fiction, but does it make a good story? Do you believe in those characters who all get together? I don't know. I believe in a story where people try to build a space elevator, but they can't figure out how to build the ribbon for it because it turns out carbon nanotubes weren't the right thing after all. Or that there's a bunch of VC funding for a material for the space elevator, so they build it out of shitty material and then a bunch of people are killed. It's still about building the space elevator, but it incorporates all of these real-world obstacles that we actually encounter when trying to build a better future. Same thing goes for things like genetic engineering, which I'm like pro-GMO. I would love for my offspring to be like an octopus is on another planet. But most people find the idea of altering their gene line to be morally abhorrent. They find it to be just creepy. People are grossed out by it on a visceral level. So if you really want to advocate for that kind of future, you have to incorporate those voices and those feelings so that ultimately many people can feel drawn in. But that's the problem, right? Is they may not get the message, right? So you may be saying like, this book is totally pro-GMO, awesome! And people are reading it and they're like, wow, this book really confirmed my sense that genetically engineering our children is a bad, bad thing. So that's what you sacrifice if you write fiction. You sacrifice your ability to be very clear and say, absolutely, what I'm arguing for is this. Because if you do that, it's just a boring story. It's just a bunch of people making speeches. So yeah, so that's one of the decisions that you have to make.
Well, we've still got another 5 minutes for questions. So does anybody have another question at this particular time?
There's a question back there.
All right. Yeah, shout out.
I was wondering in your threefold division where you would put books like Strauss and Gawker-owned Advocacy or Stanislaw Lem's Futurological Congress. I mean, they seem to kind of float across the categories. You just talk about that sort of approach, sort of the parody approach. You're not really advocating for it. You're not saying it's bad. We don't want to go there.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, so the question is, where do people like Charlie Strauss and Cory Doctorow fit in, who are kind of, you were saying kind of joking, like parody, like there's a little bit of parody in there. And actually there is a strong strand of satire in science fiction writing. And satire, of course, can work as a dystopian kind of message, because you make, like Idiocracy is my favorite kind of sci-fi satire, where it's like, everyone's become really dumb because they've been watching terrible TV and reading bad websites, and other things. So I think things like a classic Charlie Strauss novel, I'm trying to think of I really like Glass House. I think that's a great book. That has all the post-human crap and people going into portals and getting, reconstructed from the molecular level up and stuff like that. It's doing both, right? It's advocating for a future where we become post-human because it's absolutely blisteringly obvious that it's way better to be able to upload your brain into a new body when you're dying than it is to just die. There's no question. And I think Ian M. Banks is another great example of somebody who does this, where you see this post-human culture, which is actually called the culture, where everything is clearly better because there's not any disease and death is optional and stuff like that. But at the same time, there are all these dark things that are happening. And so I think the reason why Strauss is successful as a writer is because he does what I was describing good fiction does, which is he kind of does a thought experiment with you. He'll say, well, here's some dark stuff, and here's some good stuff, and here's how things will be used in ways you didn't expect. People will have home nanotechnology, and they'll get a virus, and they'll wake up in the morning, and their home nanobot will have created a bunch of dildos with the name of a sex toy store on them, because they, that actually happens in Rule 34. It's really great. And so I think it fits into a little bit, he's trying to be realistic, and I think a little bit maybe Strauss, and I would say Cory as well, they may not really be advocating a future. I think they may be advocating thought experiments about futures. So thinking about what are all the different sides to it. So of course, I guess what I'm saying is not all science fiction is advocacy futurism, right? Some of it is. Certainly Neil Stephenson is super excited about that right now, and which is great. But not everyone. William Gibson hates that idea. When I interviewed him, I asked him about that, and he was just I never, ever, ever want to write anything that advocates anything, because that is horrible and it's just disgusting and revolting. He was actually kind of physically repulsed by the idea. So I think, there's the art of fiction writing, and then there's the art of futurist advocacy, and they aren't always the same. So, all right. Well, I think we are out of time. So thanks very much.
Thanks very much. Thanks everybody for coming along. I'd like to do a big shout out for Alan, for allowing us to have the bookshop event here. So the Borderlands, put your hands together for Borderlands Books. Thank you very much. We do have a break now, so it's an opportune time to fill yourself up with coffee or peruse books.